The clock on my kitchen wall reads 2:17 in the morning, and I am staring at my phone like it might bite me. The screen glows pale blue in the darkness of my apartment, casting shadows across the empty coffee mug beside my elbow and the stack of unpaid bills I keep meaning to address. Outside, the city breathes in its restless sleep. Distant sirens, the hum of late-night traffic, the occasional bark of a dog echoing between buildings. But inside, everything is still except for the tremor in my hands. The message sits there, unread and unanswered for 6 hours now. I know what it says without looking. I memorized every word the moment it appeared. I meant it. You know, what I said, no punctuation after my name. No casual emoji to soften the weight of it. Just those 8 words that have been circling my mind like vultures ever since. I set the phone face down on the scratched wooden table and leaned back in my chair, feeling the familiar ache in my lower back from too many hours hunched over design mock-ups. This apartment has been home for 8 years, but tonight it feels like a museum of my own indecision. The same secondhand furniture I bought when I first moved here. The same books lined up on shelves I assembled myself, badly, with an Allen wrench and stubborn determination. The same framed photograph on the refrigerator, Landon and me at his college graduation, both of us squinting into bright sunlight, his arm slung across my shoulders like it belonged there. I closed my eyes and let myself remember that night. 3 weeks ago now, though it feels like both a lifetime and yesterday. The rain had been falling in sheets against the tin roof of Mickey's Tavern, that dive bar on the east side where nobody we knew would think to look for us. We had claimed the back patio despite the weather, huddled under the narrow overhang with our drinks and the weight of things we never said. Landon had been different that night, quieter than usual, but not in the comfortable way that comes from decades of friendship. This was the quiet of someone carrying something heavy, something that kept making him reach for his whiskey glass a little too often. His cheeks were flushed, from the alcohol, from the humid air, from something else I couldn't name. His dark hair had grown longer than he usually kept it, curling slightly at the edges where the rain had touched it, and when he looked at me across the small table, his eyes held a kind of exhaustion I had never seen before. We had been talking about nothing important. Work frustrations, a movie we both wanted to see, the way his youngest daughter had learned to ride her bike without training wheels. Normal things. Safe things. The kind of conversation that had carried us through 20 years of friendship without ever threatening to become something more dangerous. But then the silence stretched between us, longer than usual, and I watched something shift in his expression. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and the space between us seemed to shrink and expand all at once. The rain drummed overhead, drowning out the voices from inside the bar, creating a pocket of intimacy that felt both natural and terrifying. When he spoke, his voice was lower than normal, roughened by whiskey and whatever internal battle he had been fighting. "I want to try something I've never done before," he said. The words came out slowly, deliberately, like he had been rehearsing them. "With you." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder. That suspended instant when you know something enormous has just happened but the full impact hasn't reached you yet. I remember the taste of my beer turning bitter in my mouth. I remember the way my heart seemed to forget its rhythm for several beats. I remember thinking, with perfect clarity, that this was the moment everything would change between us, and there would be no going back. He was still looking at me, waiting for some kind of response, and I could see the vulnerability written across his face like words on a page. This was Landon, my best friend since we were 13, the person who knew me better than anyone else in the world, sitting across from me and offering something I had never dared to hope for and had never allowed myself to want. Not really, not out loud, not even in the privacy of my own thoughts. But I also saw the fear there, the way his fingers worried at the edge of a napkin, the way he kept glancing toward the door like he might bolt at any second. This wasn't seduction or confidence or any of the scenarios I might have imagined in weaker moments. This was raw honesty from someone who had reached the end of his ability to carry a secret alone. I think I said his name. Just that. Landon, like a question and a plea and a warning all wrapped together. But I couldn't find any other words. How do you respond to someone offering to dismantle 20 years of carefully constructed boundaries? How do you tell your straight, married best friend that you have been in love with him since before you even understood what that meant? The rain kept falling, and we kept sitting there in that charged silence, both of us knowing that something fundamental had just shifted between us. Later, I would replay this moment countless times, examining every detail like evidence in a case I was trying to solve. The exact shade of neon light reflected in his eyes, the way his wedding ring caught the glow from inside the bar, the sound of my own breathing, suddenly too loud in my ears. But in that moment, all I could do was sit there and feel the weight of 20 years of unspoken feelings settling between us like a physical presence. All I could do was look at my best friend, this person I had built my adult life around in ways I had never fully acknowledged, and realize that he was offering me everything I had never allowed myself to want, and I had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Now, sitting in my kitchen at 2 in the morning with his text message burning a hole in my phone, I understand that this is what the beginning of the end feels like. Not dramatic or sudden, but quiet and inevitable, like watching a fault line slowly spread across familiar ground. I pick up my phone again, thumb hovering over the keyboard, and wonder if some conversations are too dangerous to start, even when, especially when, they might be the most honest ones you'll ever have. I suppose I should tell you about my life, about the careful architecture of routine I have built around myself like walls. I am 33 years old, and I work as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown. My apartment sits on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse building, the kind of place that was once used for manufacturing something useful, but now houses people like me. Urban professionals who live alone and pay too much rent for the privilege of pretending we chose this isolation. Every morning at 7, I make coffee in the same ceramic mug I bought at a garage sale 6 years ago. The handle has a small chip near the top that I run my thumb across while I wait for the caffeine to work its quiet magic. I listen to true crime podcasts during my commute, not because I find them particularly engaging, but because they fill the silence without demanding emotional investment. The voices of strangers discussing tragedies I will never fully understand seem safer than music, which has a way of reaching places I prefer to keep locked. Most evenings, I eat frozen dinners while watching documentaries about places I will probably never visit. I have friends, co-workers I grab drinks with occasionally, a neighbor who waters my plants when I travel for work, college acquaintances who like my Instagram posts but never call. Pleasant connections, surface-level comfortable, the kind that allow me to feel socially functional without requiring me to reveal anything that matters. But none of them are Landon. None of them carry 20 years of shared history like a secret language between us. None of them remember the way I used to stutter when I was nervous, or how I once threw up on the tilt-a-whirl at the county fair when we were 14, or that I keep a small scar on my left palm from the time we tried to build a treehouse with tools we borrowed without permission. Landon has been the constant in my life since we were 13, that awkward year when everything about adolescence felt like a test I was failing. We met at summer camp, one of those character-building experiences our parents inflicted on us with good intentions. He was the kid who could start a fire with wet matches and catch fish with his bare hands, while I was the one who brought 3 books and spent most of the week hiding from team-building exercises. But somehow we found each other in that landscape of forced camaraderie. 2 kids who understood that sometimes friendship is less about having things in common and more about recognizing something familiar in another person's eyes. High school cemented our bond. Friday nights spent playing video games in his basement while his parents hosted dinner parties upstairs. Late-night phone conversations about everything and nothing. Girls he had crushes on. Colleges we dreamed of attending. The strange weight of growing up in a world that seemed to expect us to have everything figured out by 18. I was his best man when he graduated, just as he was mine, both of us grinning in photographs that now feel like artifacts from someone else's life. While I drifted through my 20s, changing jobs and cities and apartments like someone searching for a place that would finally feel like home, Landon built the life everyone expected him to build. He married Clara 3 years after college, a sweet, practical woman who taught elementary school and made elaborate birthday cakes from scratch. They bought a house in the suburbs with a 2-car garage and a backyard big enough for the children they planned to have. Those children arrived on schedule. Emma, now 8, who inherited Landon's stubborn streak and Clara's gentle laugh, and James, 5, who collects rocks and asks questions that have no easy answers. From the outside, Landon's life looks like success. The kind of steady progression that parents point to when they talk about their children doing well. But I have known him long enough to recognize the signs of wear around the edges. The way his voice sounds just slightly flatter when he talks about work. How he lingers at my apartment after what was supposed to be a quick visit, finding excuses to delay his return home. The careful way he talks about Clara now, with the kind of practiced affection that sounds more like duty than desire. I used to think I envied him. The certainty of his choices, the conventional markers of adult achievement. But somewhere in the last few years, I began to suspect that he might envy me in return. The freedom to change direction without consulting anyone else. The ability to make decisions based solely on what I want rather than what others need from me. The luxury of a life that disappoints no one because no one expects anything from it. We still talk several times a week, text messages and phone calls that feel as natural as breathing. But lately, there has been something different in those conversations. Longer pauses. Careful navigation around topics that used to be safe. A quality of attention when he looks at me that makes my chest tighten with something I refuse to name. I tell myself this is normal, that friendships evolve as people age and circumstances change. I tell myself that the charged moments I sometimes think I notice, the way his hand might rest on my shoulder a few seconds longer than necessary, or how his eyes will catch mine and hold them until one of us looks away, are products of my imagination, wishful thinking I should be ashamed of entertaining. But then nights like the one at Mickey's Tavern happen, and all my careful self-deception crumbles like paper in rain. Suddenly, I am forced to confront the possibility that 20 years of friendship might have been building towards something I never dared to hope for, and am terrified to lose. The text message arrived at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. Just 2 words that made my stomach drop. You around? I was already in bed, halfway through a book I wasn't really reading, when my phone buzzed against the nightstand. The casual phrasing couldn't hide the weight behind it. Landon never texted this late unless something was wrong. I called him back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail, so I typed back that yes, I was home, and within 20 minutes I heard his footsteps in the hallway outside my door. When I opened it, he looked like he had been walking through a storm. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there was something hollow in his eyes that made me step aside without asking questions. He moved past me into the living room and stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking around my apartment like he was seeing it for the first time. I offered him a beer, coffee, water, anything to fill the silence that stretched between us like a taut wire. He accepted the beer but didn't drink it, just held the cold bottle against his palm while he sat heavily on my couch. I took the chair across from him, the same positions we had occupied countless times over the years, but tonight the familiar geography felt different, charged with an energy I couldn't name. He started talking about Clara, but not in the way he usually did, not with the careful, practiced affection I had grown accustomed to hearing. Instead, his words came out flat and tired, like someone reading from a script he had memorized but no longer believed in. He told me about their argument earlier that evening, how it had started over something trivial, whose turn it was to take Emma to soccer practice, and escalated into something larger and more fundamental. She asked me if I was happy, he said, staring at the beer bottle in his hands. Just like that, out of nowhere. And I couldn't answer her, Adrian. I sat there like an idiot and couldn't answer her. The way he said my name made something twist in my chest. There was a vulnerability in it I had rarely heard before, as if he were testing the weight of it on his tongue. I asked him what he told her, and he laughed, a bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. I told her I was tired, he said, which is true, but not the kind of truth she was looking for. I'm tired all the time now, tired of pretending that this is enough, that this life I built is actually mine. I had never heard him talk this way before, with such raw honesty about the choices that had seemed so inevitable when he made them. Marriage, children, the house in the suburbs, all the markers of adult success that everyone expected from someone like Landon. But sitting in my living room at midnight, he looked like a man who had woken up in someone else's life and couldn't figure out how he had gotten there. I suggested we go out for a drink, partly because I thought it might help him, but mostly because I couldn't bear the weight of his confession in the enclosed space of my apartment. We ended up at Mickey's Tavern, that dive bar where nobody we knew would think to look for us. The rain had just started when we arrived, drumming against the tin roof with increasing intensity as the night wore on. Landon drank more than usual, and I let him. He needed something to soften the edges of whatever he was carrying, and alcohol seemed safer than most alternatives. We talked about inconsequential things at first: work, the kids, a movie we had both seen and hated. But as the whiskey worked its way through his system, the careful barriers he usually maintained began to crumble. He told me about the dreams he used to have, back in college, about traveling to places that didn't exist on any map. He talked about the novel he had started writing in his early 20s and abandoned when real life began making demands he couldn't ignore. He mentioned, almost casually, that sometimes he would drive past my apartment building on his way home from work, just to see if my lights were on, though he could never explain why. The rain grew heavier, creating a cocoon of sound around our table on the back patio. Other customers drifted away as the night deepened, leaving us essentially alone in our pocket of neon-lit intimacy. That was when something shifted in Landon's demeanor, when the alcohol and exhaustion and months of unspoken feelings finally overwhelmed his ability to keep them contained. He looked at me across the small table, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before, not just vulnerability, but a kind of desperate courage. He reached across the space between us and placed his hand on my wrist, and the contact sent electricity up my arm. "There's something I've been thinking about for years," he said, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Something I never said to anyone, not even Clara. Maybe especially not Clara." His hand was still on my wrist, warm and slightly trembling, and I could feel my pulse racing beneath his fingers. I knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from 20 years of friendship, that whatever he was about to say would change everything between us. There would be no going back to the careful distance we had maintained, no returning to the safe boundaries that had kept our friendship intact for so long. "I trust you," he said simply, and those 3 words carried more weight than any declaration of love ever could. The days after Mickey's Tavern passed like scenes from someone else's life. I moved through my routine: coffee at 7, podcasts on the train, design mock-ups that seemed to blur together on my screen, but everything felt slightly off-kilter, like walking through a house where all the furniture has been moved 3 inches to the left. I couldn't stop replaying his words. The way he had leaned across that small table, rain drumming overhead, and said he wanted to try something he had never done before. With me. The weight of his hand on my wrist. The vulnerability in his eyes when he said he trusted me. I had mumbled something noncommittal in response, something about it being late, and maybe we should talk about this when he was sober, and we had left the bar in a silence that felt thick with unfinished conversations. But what haunted me most was not what he had said, but what I had felt in that moment. 20 years of carefully buried feelings had surfaced all at once, like a dam breaking, and I was still trying to process the flood. I had spent so long convincing myself that my feelings for Landon were a manageable inconvenience, background noise I could live with, that I was unprepared for the intensity of wanting that had crashed over me when he offered what I had never dared to hope for. Landon, for his part, seemed determined to pretend that night had never happened. His text messages resumed their normal rhythm: updates about work, photos of the kids, complaints about his commute. Surface-level friendly, carefully casual, as if he had not just upended 20 years of friendship with a few whispered words in a dive bar. But I knew him well enough to recognize the performance. There was a new quality to his messages, a deliberate lightness that felt like someone whistling past a graveyard. A week passed before he showed up at my apartment again. This time he called first, asked if I wanted company, said he needed space from the house for a few hours. I told him yes before I could think better of it. And within an hour he was at my door with a 6-pack of the beer we used to drink in college and an expression I couldn't quite read. We settled into our familiar positions, him on the couch, me in the chair, but the comfortable geography felt different now, charged with awareness. Every glance carried weight. Every casual touch, his hand brushing mine when he passed me a beer, his shoulder bumping against me when we both reached for the remote, felt like a small electric shock. We talked for hours that night, but not about the thing we both knew we should be discussing. Instead, we excavated old memories like archaeologists, digging up stories from high school, college, the early years of our friendship when everything had seemed simpler. He reminded me of the time we had driven to the coast on a whim our senior year, sleeping in his car and surviving on gas station coffee and determination. I brought up the night we had gotten lost trying to find a party and ended up talking until sunrise in a 24-hour diner, making elaborate plans for our futures that had seemed both inevitable and impossible. But even as we retreated into the safety of the past, I could feel something building between us and the present. A tension that made the air feel thick, made every silence stretch longer than it should. We were both being careful, I realized, navigating around the edges of what had happened at Mickey's Tavern like it was a crater in the middle of our friendship. Around midnight, when we had exhausted our supply of safe memories and the beer had made us both more honest than was probably wise, Landon fell quiet. He was staring at his hands, turning his wedding ring around his finger in the absent way he did when he was thinking. When he looked up at me, there was something different in his expression, not the desperate courage I had seen at the bar, but a quieter kind of resolve. "I keep thinking about what I said to you," he told me, his voice steady despite the late hour and the alcohol. "I keep thinking about whether I meant it, and whether you wanted me to mean it." The question hung between us like a challenge, and I felt my heart rate spike. This was the moment I had been both dreading and hoping for all week. The chance to address what had happened between us, to either repair the careful boundaries of our friendship or acknowledge that they had already been irreparably crossed. I asked him what he thought my answer would be, and he smiled. A small, uncertain expression that made him look younger than his 33 years. "I think," he said slowly, "that if you didn't want me to mean it, you would have said so already. I think you would have laughed it off or changed the subject or found some way to pretend it never happened. But you haven't done any of those things." He was right, of course. I had not laughed it off or dismissed his words as drunken nonsense. I had not treated his confession as something to be forgotten or forgiven. Instead, I had carried it with me like a secret, turning it over in my mind until the edges were worn smooth. The silence stretched between us, but it was different now, not uncomfortable, but charged with possibility. We were both leaning forward slightly, the space between the couch and chair seeming to shrink. I could hear my own breathing, could see the rapid rise and fall of his chest. Neither of us moved forward, but neither of us pulled away. The storm arrived on a Thursday night in early October, one of those sudden downpours that turns city streets into rivers and sends everyone scrambling for cover. I was reading in bed when I heard the pounding on my door, not the measured knock of someone making a polite visit, but the desperate rhythm of someone seeking shelter. Landon stood in my hallway soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead and his shirt transparent with rainwater. But it was not the storm outside that had left him looking so shattered. His eyes held a wild, hollow quality I had never seen before, like someone who had been walking through wreckage and could not find a way out. I pulled him inside and handed him a towel, asked if he wanted dry clothes, coffee, something stronger. He accepted the towel but ignored everything else, just stood there in my living room dripping onto the hardwood floor and shaking in a way that had nothing to do with being cold. "We had a fight," he said finally, his voice raw. "Clara and I. Not the usual kind. The kind where you say things you can't take back." I waited for him to continue, but he seemed to have used up all his words on that admission. Instead, he sank onto my couch without bothering to dry off first, and I watched the water from his clothes seep into the fabric. I had never seen him look so defeated, so completely stripped of the careful composure he usually maintained. I sat down beside him, close enough to offer comfort without crowding him, and asked what had happened. For a long time he did not answer, just stared at his hands while water dripped from his hair onto his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She knows something is wrong," he said. "She's known for months, maybe longer. The way I've been distant, distracted, coming here too often, staying too late. She confronted me tonight, asked me directly if I was having an affair." My stomach clenched at the word. An affair suggested something tawdry and deliberate, something that bore no resemblance to the confused longing that had been building between us. But I understood why Clara might see it that way, the late-night visits, the emotional distance, the way Landon had been slowly pulling away from his life at home. "I told her no," he continued, "because technically that's the truth. But then she asked me something else. She asked if I was in love with someone else." The silence that followed felt like a physical presence in the room. I could hear the rain against the windows, the distant rumble of thunder, the sound of my own heart beating too fast. I knew what his answer had been before he said it. could read it in the devastation written across his face. I couldn't lie to her, Adrian. Not about that. Not when she was looking at me like that, like she already knew and was just waiting for me to be honest. So he had told her. Not everything. Not the specific details of what had been building between us, but enough. Enough to confirm what she had suspected. Enough to crack the foundation of their marriage. Enough to send him running through a storm to the only person who might understand. What did she say? I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to know. She asked if it was you. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had always assumed that whatever happened between Landon and me would remain contained within the bubble of our friendship, that Clara would never have to know about the quiet catastrophe we had been creating. But of course she had figured it out. 20 years of friendship, all those evenings he spent at my apartment, the way his face changed when he talked about me. The signs had probably been obvious to anyone paying attention. I couldn't answer her, he said. I just stood there like a coward while she put the pieces together herself. She didn't yell or cry or throw things. She just looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, like she was looking at a stranger. Then she told me she was taking the kids to her mother's for a few days, that I should figure out what I actually want before they come back. He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tighten with fear and hope in equal measure. This was not the desperate courage I had seen at Mickey's Tavern, or the careful testing of boundaries that had marked our recent conversations. This was the look of someone who had lost everything he thought he wanted and was finally free to admit what he actually needed. I don't know how to do this, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know how to want something I was never supposed to want, or how to love someone in a way that doesn't fit any of the stories I was told about what my life should look like. The word love hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we were brave enough to cross. But then he reached for me, his wet fingers finding mine, and I felt something shift inside my chest like a lock finally turning. I've been in love with you since I was 17, I heard myself say, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Maybe longer. I just never let myself believe it could be anything more than a secret I would carry alone. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes wide with something that might have been relief or terror or both. Then, without saying another word, he leaned forward and kissed me. The kiss lasted only seconds, but its aftermath stretched for weeks like ripples across still water. We pulled apart immediately, both breathing hard. The space between us suddenly electric with the weight of 20 years of unspoken truth finally given form. Landon's eyes were wide with something that looked like terror, and I realized that wanting something and actually having it were two entirely different kinds of fear. He left that night without saying goodbye, just mumbled something about needing to think and disappeared into the storm. I sat on my couch for hours afterward, touching my lips and trying to understand what had just happened. The kiss had been everything I had imagined and nothing like I expected. Tender and desperate and terrifying all at once, like standing at the edge of a cliff and finally understanding how far the drop really was. The silence that followed was different from anything we had navigated before. No casual text messages, no phone calls about work or the weather or inconsequential things that used to carry us through the spaces between seeing each other. Just absence, heavy and deliberate, like the pause between lightning and thunder when you hold your breath and wait for the world to shake. I threw myself into work with the kind of desperate focus I usually reserve for deadlines. Design mock-ups, client meetings, late nights at the office that stretched until my eyes burned and my back ached from hunching over my desk. Anything to avoid the silence of my apartment, where every surface seemed to hold the memory of his presence. But I could not stop thinking about the look in his eyes when he pulled away from me. Not regret, exactly, but a kind of overwhelmed recognition, like someone who had been walking in darkness and suddenly found themselves in blinding light. He had wanted this. I was certain of that. But wanting something and being able to live with the consequences were two entirely different propositions. 2 weeks passed before I heard from him. A single text message that arrived at 3 in the morning. Can we talk? We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those generic chains where neither of us would run into anyone we knew. He looked like he had not been sleeping well. Dark circles under his eyes, hair that needed cutting, clothes that seemed to hang looser on his frame. But there was something different in his posture, a kind of weary resolution that had not been there before. Clara knows, he said without preamble, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he had not touched. Not just suspects, knows. I told her everything. My stomach dropped. Everything meant the kiss, the years of buried feelings, the careful erosion of boundaries that had led us to that moment on my couch. It meant that whatever had been private between us was now part of the larger wreckage of his marriage, and I felt a surge of guilt that surprised me with its intensity. How did she take it? I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to know. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Like someone who had been expecting a bomb to go off and was almost relieved when it finally exploded. She said she had been waiting for me to figure it out for years. Apparently, I was the only one who didn't see it coming. The coffee shop buzzed with morning conversations around us, people discussing weekend plans, work deadlines, ordinary problems that seemed impossibly simple from where I sat. I envied them their uncomplicated lives, their ability to navigate the world without constantly questioning the foundations of everything they had built. She's filing for divorce, Landon continued, his voice flat with exhaustion. She's being civil about it, for the kids' sake, but she made it clear that she's not interested in trying to salvage something that was probably broken long before I had the courage to admit it. The word divorce hit me like a physical blow, even though I had known this was the inevitable conclusion to everything that had been building between us. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing its reality were two different kinds of violence. And what about us? I asked, because I needed to know, even if the answer might destroy me. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that was both terrifying and wonderful. Not the desperate confusion that had marked our interactions for weeks, but a kind of quiet certainty that felt like the opposite of everything I had expected. I don't know how to do this, he said. I don't know how to be someone who leaves his family for feelings he doesn't understand, or how to love someone in a way that doesn't fit any of the stories I was told about what love should look like. But I know I can't pretend anymore that this isn't real. The honesty in his voice was like a blade, cutting through all the careful justifications and rationalizations I had been constructing around our situation. This was not about convenience or experimentation or the comfortable familiarity of 20 years of friendship. This was about love, messy and complicated and destructive, but undeniably real. But then he said something that stopped my heart completely. I need time, Adrian, to figure out custody arrangements, to help the kids understand what's happening, to end my marriage in a way that doesn't destroy everyone involved. I need time to be sure that what I'm feeling isn't just panic or midlife crisis or some desperate attempt to escape responsibilities I'm not brave enough to face. I understood what he was asking for, space to dismantle his life methodically rather than in the explosive chaos we had created. But I also understood what he was not saying. That time might lead him back to the safety of his old life, that the weight of responsibility might crush whatever fragile thing had been growing between us. We sat in silence for a long time, both of us knowing that this conversation was an ending of sorts, even if we were not sure what it was ending or what would come after. I found Landon's spare key on my kitchen counter 3 days after our conversation at the coffee shop. No note, no explanation, just the familiar brass key he had carried for 8 years, sitting next to my coffee mug like a small surrender. I stared at it for a long time, understanding what it meant without needing words. He was giving me space to choose myself for once, to step away from the wreckage we had created together before it consumed what was left of either of us. I did not throw the key away. Instead, I placed it in the drawer where I kept important documents, birth certificate, lease agreement, things that mattered but were rarely needed. Someday, I thought, I might be ready to give it back to him. But not yet. Not while the weight of everything unspoken still pressed against my chest like a physical ache. The weeks that followed moved with the strange, suspended quality of a life in transition. I returned to my routines, coffee at 7, podcasts on the train, frozen dinners in front of documentaries. But everything felt hollow, like going through the motions of someone else's existence. My coworker Maya asked if I was feeling okay, said I looked tired. My neighbor commented that I had not been playing music lately, wondered if my speakers were broken. Small observations that added up to the recognition that grief, even when it was chosen, left visible marks. I heard about his life in fragments, the way you learn about distant weather through scattered reports. Clara had indeed filed for divorce, but they were handling it with the kind of careful civility that prioritized the children above their own wounded feelings. Landon had moved into a small apartment across town, close enough to maintain his custody schedule, but far enough to establish clear boundaries. He was seeing a therapist, according to a mutual friend who mentioned it casually at a birthday party I almost had not attended. The information arrived like postcards from a country I had once visited but could no longer enter. I was glad he was taking care of himself, grateful that his children would not bear the full weight of their parents' complicated choices. But I also felt the sharp edge of exclusion, the understanding that I had become part of what he needed space from in order to heal. Spring arrived early that year, one of those sudden shifts when winter releases its grip all at once and the city remembers how to breathe again. I found myself walking more, taking longer routes home from work, sitting in parks where I watched other people navigate their ordinary lives with what seemed like effortless grace. Couples holding hands, families sharing picnic lunches, friends laughing over jokes I could not hear. All the simple human connections that suddenly felt both precious and impossibly complex. It was on one of these walks, 6 months after I had last seen Landon, that I found myself back at Mickey's Tavern. Not intentionally. I had been wandering without destination and my feet had simply carried me there. The same neon sign buzzed in the window. The same tin roof gleamed under the late afternoon sun. But the sight of it no longer felt like a wound. Instead, it felt like a landmark from a journey I had completed, a place that belonged to the person I had been rather than the person I was becoming. I ordered a beer and claimed the same table on the back patio where everything had changed between us. No rain this time. Just the golden light of early evening and the distant sounds of the city settling into night. I thought about that conversation, the way he had leaned across the small table and offered me something I had never dared to hope for. How terrifying and necessary that moment had been, even knowing where it would lead us. My phone buzzed against the table. A text message from an unknown number that resolved into familiar words when I opened it. Hope you're doing okay. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the old flutter of recognition mixed with something newer and steadier. Hope you're doing okay. Such a simple sentiment, but weighted with everything we could not say to each other. That he thought about me sometimes. That he wished me well. That whatever had broken between us had not destroyed his capacity for care. I typed several responses and deleted them all. Thank you. I miss you. I hope you're finding what you need. None of them felt adequate to the complexity of what I wanted to communicate. In the end, I settled for something simpler, more honest. Me too. I sent the message and then slid my phone into my pocket, not waiting for a response. Some conversations, I had learned, were complete in their incompleteness. Some connections could only be honored by letting them exist without demanding they become something else. I finished my beer as the sun set behind the buildings, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. When I finally stood to leave, I felt lighter somehow, as if I had been carrying something heavy without realizing it, and had finally learned how to set it down. Not because I loved him less, but because I had finally learned the difference between loving someone and needing them to love you back in the way you had always imagined. Walking home through the warm evening air, I understood that this was what the end of one story and the beginning of another felt like. Not dramatic or final, but quiet and full of possibility, like stepping into a life that was entirely my own.